Veyrath Hollow was not a quiet place. The space station hummed and clicked and breathed like something alive. Pipes ran along every ceiling. Lights shifted from blue to gold depending on which section a visitor stood in. The air smelled different in every corridor, sweet in the guest halls, sharp and metallic near the engine rooms, and warm and heavy near the hatchery wing, where the smell of dry scales and old straw drifted out from under the doors like a sleeping breath. Creatures from dozens of worlds passed through Veyrath Hollow every season. Tall grey Velhari with their 4 arms and slow careful steps. Short wide Grethians who traveled in groups and spoke in low humming tones. Pale-eyed Solvani traders who never blinked and always seemed to know what a person was about to say before they said it. The station had seen everything. It had hosted diplomats and merchants and bonding candidates from species that humans had not even heard of yet. But humans were new here. The small delegation from Earth had arrived that morning on a transport vessel that looked modest next to the larger alien ships docked along the outer ring. There were 6 adults in the group, ambassadors, advisors, and one quiet man named Alan who worked as a cultural liaison and had brought his daughter along only because there had been no other choice. His wife was away on a separate assignment. There was no one back home to look after her. And so Clara had come. She was 11 years old. She was small for her age, with dark eyes and short brown hair that never stayed flat no matter how many times she pressed it down. She carried a worn canvas bag over one shoulder and walked close behind her father as the delegation moved through the arrival corridor. Everything around her was enormous and strange and loud in ways she had not expected. She had thought space would be silent. Nobody had told her that space stations never were. The Velhari welcome officer guided the human group through the main halls with long smooth strides that forced the humans to walk quickly to keep up. Clara stayed at the back. She looked at everything. The walls were covered in panels of soft glowing script that she could not read. The floors were a dark material that felt slightly soft under her shoes, like walking on packed moss. Other creatures passed them in the corridors and glanced at the humans with expressions Clara could not read either. She did not mind. She was used to being the one who did not quite fit. The delegation was taken to a set of guest quarters near the diplomatic wing and told to rest before the formal meetings began the following morning. The rooms were clean and simply arranged. Clara was given a small space off her father's room with a narrow bed and a round window that looked out at the stars. She sat on the edge of the bed for a while and looked at them. They did not look different from how they looked at home. That was the one thing that felt familiar. Her father knocked and looked in after an hour. He asked if she was hungry. She said a little. He brought her something from the meal station down the hall, a soft grain dish that the Velhari staff said was safe for human digestion. It tasted like warm oats with something faintly sweet mixed in. Clara ate it slowly and her father sat across from her and explained that she was to stay close to the guest quarters while the adults were in meetings. She could walk the visitor corridors but not the restricted ones. There were maps on the wall panels in the hallway. He trusted her to be sensible. Clara nodded. She was always sensible. That was one of the things people said about her. Quiet and sensible. She did not think it was a compliment exactly, but she had stopped thinking about it. After her father left, she sat by the round window again for a while. Then she picked up her bag and went into the hallway. The visitor corridor maps were simple enough to follow. Blue lines meant open areas. Red meant restricted. She followed a blue line that curved gently to the left and walked for several minutes past other guest rooms and a small common area where 2 Grethian travelers sat across from each other in silence. Neither of them looked at her. She kept walking. The corridor opened into a wider gallery with high walls and long transparent panels that looked into large enclosed spaces. Clara slowed down. The smell was different here. Warmer. Heavier. She stepped closer to the nearest panel and looked through. Inside was a hatchery. She had read about interspecies hatcheries before her father's delegation had left Earth. The station hosted bonding ceremonies between young creatures and their chosen companions. It was one of the things Veyrath Hollow was known for. Clara had thought it sounded interesting in the way that things in books sound interesting. She had not thought she would see it in person. There were several enclosures visible from the gallery. In some of them young creatures slept in piles of warm nesting material. In others small dragon hatchlings moved around slowly, stretching their wings or pressing their noses to the walls. They came in deep greens and dark reds and warm browns. Clara walked slowly along the gallery, looking into each enclosure. Then she reached the last one. It was set slightly apart from the others at the far end of the gallery. The enclosure was the same size as the rest, but the nesting material inside was wider and the lighting was slightly dimmer. Inside, 3 hatchlings sat apart from each other in different corners. They were pale. Not light gray or cream. Pale white, almost silver, with faint blue markings along their spines that looked like frost patterns on a cold window. Their eyes were a sharp pale gold. One of them turned its head and looked directly at Clara through the panel. She did not move. A Velhari attendant appeared at her side so quietly that Clara almost stepped back in surprise. The attendant was young, with a calm flat expression and all 4 arms folded neatly together. It looked at the enclosure, then at Clara, and spoke in careful translated tones through the small communication pin on its collar. "Those 3 are not for bonding candidates," it said. "They are dangerous. They have sent 2 visitors to the medical station already this season. You should not stand here too long." Clara looked at the pale hatchlings. The one that had been watching her had not looked away. She thought about what the attendant had said. Dangerous. She looked at the pale gold eyes watching her steadily through the barrier. She thought they did not look dangerous exactly. They looked tired. They looked like something that had been looked at a certain way for a very long time and had simply stopped expecting anything different. She knew that feeling a little. She stayed at the panel for another minute. Then she thanked the attendant quietly and walked back the way she had come. But before she turned the corner she looked back once. The pale hatchling was still watching her. It had not moved at all. Clara turned and walked back to her father's quarters. She did not say anything to him about what she had seen. She ate a small supper, washed her face, and lay down on the narrow bed. The stars outside the round window were very still. She thought about pale gold eyes for a long time before she finally fell asleep. Clara woke up early. The station was quieter in the morning than it had been the night before. The hum of the pipes was lower. The lights in the corridor outside her room had shifted to a soft pale gold that made everything look calm and still. She could hear her father moving around in the next room, getting ready for the first round of formal meetings. She could hear the low sound of his voice as he spoke to someone through his communication device. She lay on the narrow bed for a while and looked at the ceiling. It was smooth and a very faint gray and had nothing interesting about it at all. She thought about home. She thought about her school and her friends and the way the kitchen smelled in the morning when her mother made tea. She thought about their dog, a big soft brown animal named Biscuit who always slept at the foot of her bed and snored so loudly that it sometimes woke her up in the night. She had not slept well. Not because of noise. Because of pale gold eyes. She got up and dressed quietly and went to her father's room before he left. He looked tired but he smiled at her and reminded her of the corridor rules from the night before. Blue lines only. Stay in the guest and visitor areas. There was a meal station 2 corridors down where she could get breakfast. The meetings would run most of the day. He would check on her at midday. Clara nodded and told him she would be sensible. He kissed the top of her head and left with the rest of the delegation. She ate breakfast slowly at the meal station. It was a warm flat bread with something spread on it that tasted faintly like honey. She sat alone at one of the small tables and watched other creatures move through the corridor outside. A pair of Salvani passed without looking at anyone. A single Grecian stood near the wall and ate something from a small container, chewing very slowly. Nobody paid Clara any attention at all. She did not mind. She was used to that too. After breakfast she went back to the hatchery gallery. She told herself she was just walking. She was just looking around. She had read that visitors were allowed in the gallery during open hours, and the map panel in her corridor showed the hatchery gallery marked clearly in blue. She was not doing anything she was not supposed to do. She was just walking. But she went straight to the far end of the gallery without stopping at any of the other enclosures. The three pale hatchlings were exactly where they had been the night before. Two of them were in the same corners. The third one, the smallest, was sitting in the middle of the enclosure floor this time. It was not doing anything. It was just sitting very still with its pale wings folded flat against its back and its pale gold eyes half open. Clara sat down on the floor of the gallery. Not close to the barrier. A little way back from it. She crossed her legs and put her bag in her lap and just sat. She did not press her face to the panel. She did not wave or make any sound. She just sat the way she sometimes sat in her room at home when she did not feel like doing anything in particular and just wanted to be somewhere quiet. The smallest hatchling opened its eyes all the way. It looked at her for a long time. Then it looked away. Then it looked back. Clara did not move. She watched the hatchling the way she sometimes watched Biscuit when he was doing something slow and small and ordinary, like sleeping or chewing the edge of his blanket. Just watching. Not wanting anything. A Velhari attendant came by once and looked at her sitting on the floor. Clara looked up. The attendant looked at the enclosure, then back at Clara, then moved on without saying anything. Clara looked back at the hatchlings. The two in the corners had not moved. The smallest one in the middle had shifted slightly. It was facing her more directly now. She stayed there for most of the morning. Her father came to find her at midday as he had said he would. He looked at her sitting on the floor in front of the pale hatchling's enclosure, and he looked at the enclosure and he did not say anything for a moment. Then he asked if she had eaten. She said yes. He crouched down beside her for a minute and looked at the pale hatchlings. The smallest one pulled its wings in tighter and looked away. Her father said the meetings were going to run into the evening. He left her more flat bread from the meal station wrapped in a piece of thin paper. He told her to be sensible. She told him she would be. After he left she ate the bread slowly and kept watching. By the afternoon she had started talking. Not loudly. Just softly, the way she sometimes talked to Biscuit when it was late and the house was quiet and she just felt like saying things out loud without anyone making it into a conversation. She talked about Biscuit first. She described the way he looked, which was large and brown and very soft, and the way he smelled, which was like warm dust and something faintly sweet, and the way he always put his whole heavy head in her lap whenever she sat on the floor at home as if he had been waiting all day to do exactly that. She talked about her friends. There were 3 of them. She missed them. She was not always very good at saying that kind of thing, but it was easier to say it here where nobody was listening except pale gold eyes that may or may not have understood a single word. She talked about how strange it was to be somewhere so far from home where everything smelled different and the lights were the wrong color and the food tasted almost right but not quite. She said it was not bad. She just noticed it. She noticed the difference the way you notice a stone in your shoe. It does not hurt exactly, but it is always there. The station lights shifted slowly from gold to a deeper amber as the hours passed. Clara did not notice at first. She was still talking softly, her voice low and steady, her bag still in her lap. When she finally looked up at the lights she realized it was getting late. The gallery was empty of other visitors now. It was just her. She looked at the enclosure. The 2 hatchlings in the corners were asleep. Their pale sides rose and fell slowly. The smallest hatchling was no longer in the middle of the floor. It was sitting directly in front of the barrier. Right on the other side of the transparent panel. So close that Clara could see the faint blue frost markings along its nose clearly. It was watching her with its pale gold eyes very steady and very still. Clara looked at it. It looked at her. She kept talking. Softer now. She told it about the stars from her window and how they looked the same from here as they did from home and how that was the one thing that had made her feel less far away. She told it she did not really know why she kept coming back to this particular spot. She just did. She just felt like being here. She yawned eventually. A long slow yawn that she hid behind her hand. She blinked. Her eyes felt heavy. The floor of the gallery was not comfortable but it was not terrible either. She shifted her bag under her head like a flat soft pillow and lay down on her side facing the barrier. She did not mean to fall asleep. She just closed her eyes for a moment. The smallest pale hatchling did not move away. It sat on the other side of the barrier with its nose almost touching the transparent panel, steady and quiet, watching over her the way something watches over a thing it has decided, very privately and without any fuss, that it wants to keep safe. Clara slept. And for the first time since leaving home she did not wake up once in the night. The name came to Clara on the second morning. She was sitting in the hatchery gallery with the smallest pale hatchling pressed close against the barrier on the other side and she was looking at the faint blue markings along its nose. They curled in thin branching lines like ice forming on a cold window in winter. Like the frost patterns she used to trace with her finger on the glass of her bedroom window back home on cold mornings when the whole world outside looked white and still and quiet. She said the word out loud without really thinking about it. Frost. The small hatchling tilted its head to one side. Its pale gold eyes moved to her face. Clara said it again, softly. Frost. The hatchling blinked once, slowly, the way a cat blinks when it is comfortable and not afraid. Clara felt something warm settle in her chest. Not excitement exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that felt like the moment you find the right word for something you have been trying to say for a long time. She pressed her hand flat against the barrier. Frost pressed its nose against the same spot on the other side. The two hatchlings in the corners watched this without moving. They had not come forward the way Frost had. They had not pressed themselves against the barrier or tilted their heads or blinked slowly at Clara. But they had stopped shrieking. That had happened gradually over the past day, so gradually that Clara had almost not noticed it happening. They still sat apart. They still watched everything with sharp pale eyes. But when Clara sat in the gallery and spoke softly, the tension in their bodies was less. Their wings stayed folded. Their tails stayed still. They did not make a sound. It was not warmth exactly. Not yet. But it was the absence of fear. And Clara understood, in the quiet way she understood most things, that the absence of fear was where everything else had to start. Orvin came to find her father that afternoon. Clara was still in the gallery when it happened. She heard voices in the corridor behind her and turned to see Orvin moving toward the hatchery with her father beside him. Her father was listening carefully with the expression he wore in meetings, serious and still and focused. Orvin was speaking in low measured tones, the translation pin on his collar working smoothly between languages. Clara turned back to the enclosure. She did not move from her spot on the floor. Frost was still on the other side of the barrier, settled comfortably on its pale haunches, watching her with half-closed eyes. Her father and Orvin stopped a little way behind her. Orvin spoke first. He said he wanted to explain something about the pale drakenful hatchlings. He said he had wanted to explain it for some time but had not found the right moment. He said the right moment appeared to have found itself. Clara's father said nothing. He waited. Orvin said that the pale drakenful were not aggressive creatures by nature. This was the first thing most species got wrong about them. Every record of their behavior described shrieking and scratching and driving visitors away, and so every species that came to the station came already afraid of them, already expecting the worst, already holding their bodies stiffly and their feelings tightly. And the pale Drakenful felt all of it. Clara's father asked what he meant by felt. Orvin said that the pale Drakenful were empaths. Not in a vague or poetic sense. In a direct and complete sense. They felt the emotional state of every creature that came near them the way most creatures feel temperature. Clearly. Immediately. Without any choice in the matter. A Grethian diplomat who approached their enclosure hoping to bond with a rare creature for the status it would bring to his family, the pale Drakenful felt that the moment he came within range. A Velhari bonding candidate who was afraid of being rejected and was trying very hard not to show it, they felt that too. Every layer. Every hidden thing. Clara's father was quiet for a moment. Then he asked what that felt like. For the hatchlings. Orvin said it was like being in a very small room with something loud that would not stop. Every hidden fear and every selfish wish and every careful performance pressed in on them from all sides. So they shrieked. They scratched. They drove every visitor away because driving them away was the only way to make the noise stop. Clara had been listening without turning around. She kept her eyes on Frost. Frost had opened its eyes fully now and was looking past her toward Orvin and her father. Its pale gold gaze was steady and calm. Her father asked quietly what had been different about Clara. Orvin was silent for a moment. When he spoke again his voice was careful and low, as if he was saying something that mattered and wanted to make sure he said it correctly. He said that when the pale Drakenful felt Clara approaching on the first evening, they felt nothing complicated. No agenda. No performance. No fear dressed up as confidence. He said that what they felt from her was very simple. He said it was loneliness. Plain and quiet and honest. The kind of loneliness that does not try to hide itself or explain itself or turn itself into something more acceptable. Just the straightforward feeling of a small person who was very far from home and wanted, more than anything else, a friend. He said that to a creature that spent every hour being pressed on all sides by complicated and hidden and layered feelings, that kind of simplicity was like walking out of a loud room into a silent one. Clara's father did not say anything for a long moment. Clara kept her hand flat against the barrier. Frost kept its nose against the same spot on the other side. The two hatchlings in the corners had their eyes open and were watching Orvin with something that was not quite calm but was closer to calm than anything Clara had seen from them before. Orvin said one more thing. He said he had been working at Veyrath Hollow for a very long time. He said he had seen many bondings and many failures and many creatures that other species had decided were broken or dangerous or simply not worth the effort. He said that in his experience the creatures that got labeled that way were almost never broken. They were almost always just waiting. Waiting for someone who was not bringing anything hidden into the room. Someone who was not trying to win something or prove something or take something. Just someone who wanted company the way a person wants company when they are sitting alone in a quiet place and the world feels very large and they would simply like another living thing nearby. He said it was a very human thing, in his observation, to want something that's simple and feel it that completely. Clara's father made a small sound. Clara thought it might have been the sound a person makes when something lands in exactly the right place inside them and they are not quite ready for it. She did not turn around. She did not want either of them to see her face just then because her eyes had gone a little warm and she was pressing her lips together to keep everything steady. Frost made a very small sound on the other side of the barrier. Not a shriek. Not a hiss. Something low and soft, almost like a breath with a shape to it. Clara had not heard it make that sound before. She pressed her hand a little firmer against the panel. Frost pressed back. Behind her the two hatchlings in the corners settled quietly into their nesting material, folded their pale wings, and for the first time since anyone on the station could remember, closed their pale gold eyes and simply rested. The bonding ceremony was not supposed to happen so quickly. Orvin had explained to Clara's father that formal bonding ceremonies on Veyrath Hollow usually took weeks to arrange. There were records to file and species representatives to notify and a bonding chamber to prepare. There were old protocols written in old languages that had to be followed in a specific order. It was not a small thing. It had never been a small thing. The station took bonding very seriously because a bond between a creature and its companion was considered one of the most permanent and meaningful agreements that could exist between two living things. But the pale Drakenfell case was different. Word had moved through the station faster than Orvin had expected. By the morning after his conversation with Clara's father, every senior staff member on Veyrath Hollow already knew what had happened. By midday the alien delegations in the diplomatic wing knew. By evening there were quiet clusters of Velhari and Grethian and Salvani observers standing at the far end of the hatchery gallery, speaking in low voices and looking at the pale enclosure where a small human girl sat on the floor with her hand against the barrier and the smallest pale hatchling pressed close on the other side. Nobody had ever seen a pale Drakenfell choose anyone. Not once. Not in 400 years of station records. Orvin filed the paperwork himself. He did it carefully and completely, and he did not delegate any part of it to his staff because he wanted it done correctly. He had been at Veyrath Hollow for most of his adult life. He had overseen hundreds of bonding ceremonies. He had written reports and updated records and managed the reclassification of dozens of creatures over the years. He was not a person who was easily moved by things. He was careful and measured, and he believed in doing things properly. But his hand was not entirely steady when he signed the final form. The bonding chamber was a round room near the center of the station. The walls were a deep warm amber and the floor was covered in soft pale material that felt like thick moss underfoot. There were no sharp edges anywhere in the room. The lighting was gentle and even. It was a room designed to feel safe to every kind of creature, which meant it felt slightly unusual to most of them but threatening to none. Clara stood in the middle of the chamber on the morning of the ceremony in her cleanest clothes, which were not very formal but were the best she had. Her father stood to one side. Orvin stood across from them with a thin record panel in one of his 4 hands. 2 junior Velhari staff stood near the door. And outside the open chamber doorway, filling the corridor quietly, were more observers than anyone had planned for. There were Velhari in long pale robes. There were Grethian delegates in their formal cluster arrangement, pressed close together the way they always were when something important was happening. There were 3 Salvani standing absolutely still with their pale eyes very wide. There were species Clara did not recognize and could not name, creatures she had never seen in any of her reading before the trip, standing quietly in the corridor and watching through the open door with expressions she could not entirely read but that all shared something in common. They were paying attention. Really paying attention. The kind that happens when something occurs that has not occurred before. Orvin spoke the formal words of the bonding record in the traditional Velhari ceremonial language first, then repeated them in translated standard so that everyone present could understand. He spoke clearly and without rushing. He said the name of the hatchling as it would be recorded in the station's permanent history. He said the name Clara had given it. Frost. He said it was recorded as the first pale Drakenfell bonding in the entire history of Veyrath Hollow. He said the date and the station coordinates and Clara's full name and her world of origin. He said all of it quietly and carefully, and when he finished speaking the chamber was completely silent for a moment. Then the door of the small transport crate that the staff had brought Frost in was opened. Frost came out without hesitating. It walked across the soft pale floor directly to Clara and looked up at her with its pale gold eyes for just a moment. Then it spread its wings once, slowly, the way a bird settles itself before it folds down for the night, and stepped forward onto Clara's outstretched arm and climbed up to her shoulder and curled there. Its pale tail wrapped once loosely around the back of her neck like a scarf. It put its head down against the side of her jaw and made the low soft sound it had started making 2 days ago. The one that was almost like a breath with a shape to it. Clara stood very still. Her eyes were bright. She did not say anything. Her father made a sound beside her that he turned quickly into a cough. Orvin looked at his record panel. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said there was one more matter to record. He said the other two pale drakenful hatchlings, who had not bonded and who had not been approached again by any candidate, were to have their official station classification changed. They would no longer be listed as unbondable. They would be listed as unmatched. He looked up from the panel and spoke to the observers in the doorway as much as to anyone in the room. He said the difference mattered. Unbondable meant there was something wrong with the creature. Unmatched meant the right companion simply had not arrived yet. He said the station's records had used the wrong word for a very long time and he intended to correct it today and make sure it stayed corrected. Nobody in the corridor said anything. But something shifted in the way they were all standing. The departure of the human delegation was scheduled for late that same afternoon. The shuttle bay was a large open space near the outer ring of the station where the air was cooler and the sounds of the docking systems echoed off the high walls. Clara walked through it with Frost asleep on her shoulder, the pale hatchling completely still except for the slow rise and fall of its small sides. The alien observers had followed. Not all of them. But many. They stood at the edges of the shuttle bay in quiet groups and watched the human delegation move toward the boarding ramp. Clara's father walked beside her with his bag over one shoulder and his expression was the calm careful one he usually wore in professional settings but his eyes were soft in a way that had nothing professional about it. Clara walked slowly. Not because she was sad to leave. She was ready to go home. She was ready to see Biscuit and sleep in her own bed and eat food that tasted completely right and sit in her kitchen and listen to ordinary sounds. She walked slowly because Frost was asleep and she did not want to disturb it. At the base of the boarding ramp she stopped for a moment and looked back at the shuttle bay. All those watching eyes. Velhari and Grethian and Salvani and species she still could not name. All of them quiet. All of them looking at her and at the small pale creature asleep on her shoulder with its frost-marked nose tucked against her neck. She did not know what they were thinking. She was 11 years old and she had not come here to change anything or prove anything or make any kind of point about humanity. She had come because her father had no one to leave her with. She had gone to the hatchery because she was lonely and the gallery was open and she had nowhere else to be. She had sat on a floor and talked about her dog. That was all. She turned back and walked up the ramp. The shuttle doors closed behind the delegation with a soft final sound. Clara found a seat by the small oval window and settled carefully so that Frost stayed undisturbed on her shoulder. The pale hatchling shifted once in its sleep and then was still again. The shuttle pulled away from the station slowly. Through the window Clara watched Veyrath Hollow grow smaller against the stars. The long curved body of it. The lights along its outer ring. The docking arms reaching out into the dark. She watched it until it was very small. Then she looked down at Frost. Frost was still asleep. Its pale sides rose and fell. The blue frost markings along its nose caught the faint light from the window and made them look like they were glowing slightly. Its small pale claws were hooked very gently into the fabric of Clara's collar, holding on even in sleep, the way something holds on when it has decided, quietly and completely, that it has finally found where it belongs. Clara leaned her head back against the seat. She closed her eyes. She was smiling.